Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Bean. It's my great pleasure to be able to be your moderator for this terrific conversation that we're going to have today on redesigning the student experience in Australia and New Zealand through digital transformation and collaboration. According to Salesforce's latest Connected Student Report, which we'll hear quite a bit more about in a moment, twice the number of students reported having a very good or excellent university experience this year, 34%, a significant improvement compared to the 17% having a similarly positive experience a year ago. For more than 2 years, higher education has adapted and innovated to respond to a constantly evolving environment. Now, students, faculty, and administrators are determined to continue building on the innovations sparked by the pandemic and the pandemic recovery. So today, we'll discuss with our wonderful guests why students are feeling more positively about their higher education experiences and explore how universities can ensure this trend continues. And I know we're in for a treat. I'd like to start off now by providing an acknowledgement of country. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to elders past and present. So let me tell you a little bit about our speakers today and take you through our agenda. I'm just delighted to be joined by Navneet, who is the Director for Education Go-to-Market based out of California in the United States. And you're going to be hearing a little bit more from Navneet in a moment. But I'm also delighted to be joined by Marianne Dever from ANU, the Pro-Vice Chancellor there. We were just having a fantastic conversation before the webinar got started, but also by my colleague Sherman Young from RMIT, who's the Deputy Vice Chancellor Education and Vice President. So a big welcome to you, Marianne, and to Sherman, and thank you for being with Navneet and I to share your thoughts today once we get to the panel conversation. So we're going to start off today with Navneet spending 15 minutes taking us through the report. Then we're going to come back and I'm going to run a panel with Marianne and with Sherman. I've got a few set questions for them, and then we're going to get some questions from you, and we'll take as many as we can before we wrap up this webinar. So thanks everybody for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here, and over to you, Navneet.
Great. Thank you, Martin. And thanks everyone for joining today. I'm also really excited to unpack the report a bit with you today, but then also to get into that panel discussion with Martin, Marianne and Sherman, because there's some interesting perspectives coming directly from higher education that I think will shed some additional light on the data that you're going to see today. So if you've not yet downloaded the report, I encourage you to do so. This is the third edition of our Connected Student Report, which is an annual report that we've been running now for 3 years to really better understand the perspectives of staff and students in higher education. So just as a bit of background, but when you do download that report, you'll see in the appendix the full breakdown of the student demographics and staff demographics as well. But just as a quick overview, this is a global study that we carried out of staff and students. And we collected a total of 2,668 responses, to be exact, via an online quantitative survey earlier this year. We also had the chance this year with our research vendor to really dig in and do some qualitative interviews. So we got some more color on some of the statistics and the data that we got out of the quantitative survey. And as I mentioned before, this is a global survey of the countries that you see here, then students and staff. And just as a quick bit, but like I said, more information in the appendix. Students were all either enrolled full-time or part-time at an institution in one of these countries, 18 and over. And then staff were also, the criteria was that they had to be employed full-time or part-time at a higher education institution in one of these countries to participate in the survey. So I'm going to talk about some of the findings today, but when you do actually read the report, you'll also see that the qualitative interviews really helped shape a lot of the narrative in the report, and some of the quotes, you'll see some of the quotes there that we got from the higher education leaders that we interviewed as well. So I wanted to just share with you the 4 key themes that really emerged out of this year's research. And we really wanted to sort of unpack, what makes a great student experience and why. Obviously, the past, over 2 years now have been a challenge. That's probably an understatement. And so we wanted to just kind of see, what's changed, what's stayed the same. We asked some new questions this year, but then we also asked, some questions about the student experience that we had asked in the first and second edition to see really, what has changed here. So the 4 themes that emerged was first and foremost, belonging is really the foundation for success. And a big part of this chapter, as you get into the report, you'll see is onboarding. So onboarding plays a real important role in making sure that students feel that sense of belonging right from the get-go. And it's that belonging and connection that seems to be important for students to have a great student experience. The second theme that emerged was that students need holistic support from application to graduation. So there were things such as, students were wanting more wellbeing resources, more career support, more access to academic advising. And so again, I don't think this is necessarily a surprise to probably the higher ed folks that are listening in today, but the data definitely showed us, what exactly students wanted more of in that area of holistic student support. The third one, students want to be prepared for the future of work. I'll share with you in just a second. There was a large proportion of students that said they actually choose their institution for career support and career help later on. Yet when it came to what kind of support they're receiving, it didn't quite match up. So they were selecting on that basis, but they want more in terms of direct career support and connection to the corporate world. And then finally, flexibility and diversity matter. It came up as important for students and for staff. And no surprises, I don't think, here again. Flexibility was super important during the pandemic. But again, when we ask the question about, what are the top values that an institution needs to uphold for a student to go to that institution, diversity and inclusion came up in there as the top ranking values that were important for students. And so we're seeing a lot of, changes when it comes to hiring to support more diversity and inclusion initiatives as well. And you'll see kind of more of that data here in just a second, and of course in the report once you download and get a chance to read it. So wanted to just share with you then a global highlight here. This is not for Australia specifically, but more globally, the likelihood of a great university experience. And these were some of the factors that are likely to ensure that students are more likely to get that great student experience. So I mentioned onboarding before. This was a huge one. Students who have a great onboarding experience are 35 times more likely to have a great student experience. Hence that sort of emphasis that onboarding is just so important there. The second one, again, students who feel well prepared for the world of work are going to have a better student experience. That belonging came up again. And then also that sense of connection to the student and alumni community. These were the factors or the important pieces of a great student experience for students globally. So that was definitely a similarity there. But getting into some of the statistics of those that responded in Australia specifically, we saw that overall, only 9% of students felt like they totally belong at their college or university. But you'll see here, Australia in comparison to global or even to EMEA here was a little higher in terms of totally belong, which means, there's obviously some great efforts going on, but also some room for improvement where, students who felt like maybe they don't totally belong, maybe there's an opportunity there to think more about those onboarding efforts and really dig into what students want more of there. This was an interesting one, when asked the question to students, what would help students feel better connected to the student community? And this was an open-ended question. Those who've really felt disconnected want more of these events and opportunities to socialize. And of course, this is going to look a lot different now as it did previously before the pandemic as well. And in just talking to a lot of institutions since we launched the report earlier this month, though they want more of these social events as well, there's a lot that obviously higher education institutions are doing today in terms of events, whether it's virtual or in person. So maybe the opportunity here is also to promote those in different ways and really dig into what students want out of those events, because I know there's a lot of good stuff going on here. So it was pleasing to see that students were very vocal about what they want more of, but perhaps there's also an opportunity to rethink what's already happening at institutions by way of more of these events and opportunities to socialize. Onboarding, I mentioned this earlier. I was talking to some of my colleagues actually not that long ago, said, you only get one opportunity to really make that first impression. And this is really what we're talking about here. And if we think about the corporate world, that sort of onboarding experience into a new job, that employee experience is just so important. And so, it shouldn't be any less for students. And where students were asked, how would you rate the onboarding experience at your college or university? We saw that there is a direct link between that onboarding experience and overall satisfaction. But there's an opportunity here for more students to rank that onboarding experience higher, as excellent as opposed to good. So while there's a lot of great stuff going on here, again, there is a huge room for improvement to make sure that students feel that connection during the onboarding experience, and that also it is a rethought a little bit, given that it's going to be much different to what it was in 2019. I mentioned earlier what resources as well do students want from their college or university to be successful. I mentioned the career planning, that was one of the things that was top of mind for students when selecting an institution, but also in order to be successful, they want more of that career planning, as well as more wellbeing resources. This won't be a surprise to many of you tuning in. That student wellbeing has obviously been top of mind even prior to the pandemic. Pandemic exacerbated a lot of the issues that students and staff were feeling. And so, there's really an opportunity here to think about what else can be done for students in order to support them mentally and emotionally, as well as help with managing that course load and more career planning. And I'm whizzing through this quite quickly because I said I'm keen to get into the panel discussion, but when you go into the report, you'll see a lot more detail and more data points around each one of these sections. So going back to what we said about providing holistic support as well from application to graduation, more students report a level of social and emotional support from their institution, which goes beyond basic needs, but only 33% of students said that they really feel their institution is trying hard on student well-being. And so they're being quite vocal about what they want here, that they really feel that they still need that support, even though we may be coming out of this pandemic. And so there was some things here, criteria that they selected here in terms of that support that they need. But this is interesting that students in Australia are most likely to say that their institution places great importance on well-being among the markets that were surveyed. Some of the other regions, students were not ranking still their institution that highly when it came to trying and helping with student well-being. There's a question here that we asked about how do you feel when you arrive or return to your college or university, positive versus negative feelings here. And the predominant negative emotions were stress, but Australian students are more likely to feel supported in comparison to other markets, which is again pleasing to see here. This is really an interesting one. Personalization, we asked about this because, we are hearing more and more so that in terms of, what really makes for a great student experience, making sure that it's really tailored to each and individual student, that they're seen, heard, and valued as an individual student requires a level of personalization, a certain degree of personalization. And again, kind of looking across to other industries as well, personalization is just so important when we think about consumer industries and retail industries. And so it's no different really in higher education in terms of that personalization, ensuring that students then have that great experience. So there was the question here to students: to what extent do you feel that you agree or disagree with the statements that were here? And the statement was, my college or university provides a personalized experience tailored to my needs. That was good that there was obviously lots of students who felt that their institution did do that. But again, there's an opportunity to really think about each and individual student and offer that degree of personalization from the moment they express interest to a campus to when they graduate and become alumni. There's an opportunity to really tailor that experience and offer more personalized guidance. And then just final few findings that I wanted to share with you. Again, I mentioned this earlier, the factors that were important in enrolling to college or at university. Career prospects ranked very highly there, and students really thinking about, what comes after their higher education. And so this obviously could come in many different forms, and we think about career support as well. But students are really thinking much more today about what is that connection between their higher ed experience and careers than before. And then this was where there was that slight disconnect that I mentioned, that although students are selecting future career prospects or selecting a university because of future career prospects, there's only 8% of students that responded in the Australia sample that said they really feel well prepared for work itself. So again, it's finding that connection about what students really want here in terms of that career support, and making those connections also to the corporate world, to make sure that students have those opportunities for internships and have those opportunities to really connect with the companies that they may work for in the future. And I know this is a tricky one, simply because a lot of the jobs that students will go into today don't yet exist. So there's a whole, it's hard to provide that career guidance, and we don't know what kind of jobs will be out there even in the next 5 to 10 years. But still, there's probably an opportunity for more career support here. Flexibility and diversity, I mentioned this earlier, that it really matters to students. And this one was just the difference in students that are looking for more for that lifelong learning experience from their higher ed institution versus the workplace or DIY and free options as well. You see that most Australian students are looking to their higher education for lifelong learning. So again, an opportunity for engagement and connection. And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, again, back to those values that are important to uphold. And the reason why a lot of students even choose an institution, diversity and inclusion came up in that top 2 again, showing us that it's increasingly important from previous years, as well as students are looking for a voice on campus. The student body has changed as well. We're seeing more and more diversity. So how can those students really feel a part of the institution, whether they're virtual or on campus? So I whizzed through that pretty quickly, but as I said, it's going to be some interesting perspectives here from Sherman, Marianne, and Martin on the findings here. So Martin, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Navneet. And I was just so delighted to see the results of the survey, so much food for thought. And I've just been sitting back reflecting on the sort of the employability expectation versus how well they're feeling prepared. And it really rang true to me. And I think, Navneet, even though many of the jobs don't exist for the future, one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about now are those enduring human capabilities that, irrespective of the job, I think we need to make sure that we're equipping our graduates to have them and demonstrate them, because they are becoming increasingly valued in the world of work. So thank you for giving us that whirlwind tour through the results. Folks, if I can get you to type your questions into the Q&A box, that'd be fantastic. Navneet and I are going to be keeping an eye on those so that we can take some of your questions as well. But Navneet, if we bring the slides down now, that way we will get a nice big Marianne and Sherman, and I'll get you to turn your cameras on now for me, and welcome. It's terrific to have you. There you are, Sherman. Hello, Marianne. Great to have you. So let's just dive right in. So my first question that I've got for us today is how can we create really a great onboarding experience and foster meaningful connections, not just while they're with us, but from that very first application through to graduation. And Marianne, I'm going to let you go first on that. And then Sherman, I'll look to you, and Navneet, if you've got any follow-on thoughts or ideas. Over to you, Marianne.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks, Navneet. That was a fantastic introduction to that report. And good morning, everyone. I'm talking to you today from the unceded land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra, and I'm on the campus of the Australian National University. Well, I mean, I think COVID really did help us to focus in ways I think we haven't previously on connection and engagement. We struggled in the early period of COVID, I think, to connect with our students, and I think it really helped us to understand something that possibly we hadn't really thought that much about before. But I think for us now, coming out of COVID, connection and engagement, I think all of us are seeing as deserving real attention. So, I mean, I think that in terms of how we build that, I think one of the initial things we might want to do is, and again, I think this is very important as we come out of COVID, is to understand ourselves, you know, what it is we are offering students in terms of student experience and learning as we move forward, because that's shifted around. So what it means to be a student at my particular university or Sherman's particular university may now be quite different, one from another, but also from what we've previously offered. So one of the things that I'm focusing on is how do we here at the ANU, for example, articulate for, you know, current and future students, what is the student experience and what is learning going to be like here at ANU, so that we can make sure that students are making good choices in the first instance and really selecting an institution that's going to be a good fit for what they're looking for. I think we're going to see as we emerge from COVID a great deal more diversity in what students are offering, and students shouldn't just assume it's going to be the same wherever I go. We've obviously seen as students are coming in that we're really trying to hone what we do, reshape, you know, what orientation and transition looks like at our universities. And I think there's been some really positive attention given to that space. But in particular, I think really trying to understand more about what students need at that particular point when they do start to connect with us, and particularly recognizing the diversity of students. So we don't necessarily think a one size fits all kind of orientation and transition experience is what we're after. Interestingly, there's also some discussion going around about whether we stick with the terminology of orientation, which for many universities in the past has had probably too great an emphasis, for example, on partying, and maybe instead reshaping that and you know, calling it something more like Welcome Week, you know, which articulates, I think, exactly how we want to be, you know, starting to connect with students there. For me, I think one of the really important things is going to be thinking about what happens beyond orientation and transition. And for me, where I'm really looking to put my attention at the moment is on the first year experience, because I think we're overdue for having a really hard look at what happens at first year. Because if we think about it, first year is critically important, and never more so, I think, than for the generation of students who are coming to us over the next few years. First year is where students learn to learn. They learn what university is about. And the style of engagement, the expectations that are established at first year will shape how those students continue to interact with us in subsequent years, but also I think will really establish what kind of connection we're going to have with them for the long haul. So for me, I'm really interested in thinking about what we ought to be doing at first year to really ensure that we have that good connection. And for me, a lot of that is focused here at the ANU on what's going to happen on campus. because we're still wanting to see our students here on campus, and we want that to be a very active and engaged learning experience for them. And so we're really trying to sort of think, how do we get the best out of first year and really establish, a great sense of connection with our students? Related to that, and I think it goes back, Navneet, to some of the points that you were raising around wellbeing. And I'm really keen to see in the ways in which we design first year, that we think about the design of learning and assessment in ways that acknowledge that student wellbeing actually begins in the classroom. There are things we currently do that can support wellbeing. There are probably some things that we're doing that don't necessarily support wellbeing and connection. So how can we make sure that we're really designing for student wellbeing there? So I think that those are some of the sort of things that I'm really thinking about there in terms of making those meaningful connections with our students. But related to that, I think as well, is making sure that we're using our data well, so that we actually understand who our students are. I'm not sure that we're all necessarily leveraging our data in the ways that we might, to really understand who's with us in our classrooms, who's with us here, on campus, who's with us here in our online, classes. So those are some of the things I'm also thinking about focusing on.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Some terrific thoughts. I'm just looking to Sherman and Navneet if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, happy to chime in there, Martin. And I'm coming from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne today. So pay my respects and acknowledge the ancestors and elders from those lands. I just want to pick up, there's so much there, Marianne, and thanks for articulating all that. I just want to pick up on the notion of belonging a little bit, because I think that's one thing that almost draws it all together. And we've done, and Martin would be well aware of the work that was done in the Belonging Project at RMIT some time ago. But certainly there's the idea of thinking about belonging with a number of dimensions, belonging to the place and the culture, belonging to the university and its missions and its values, belonging with your peers, your like-minded cohort, belonging in the learning in the classroom, pre-COVID in the classroom, post-COVID in whatever we're replacing that or supplementing it with. And then importantly, because I think this is one that ties together a little bit for me, belonging to the profession and the career. So I think, universities almost have a responsibility to think about that belonging piece quite holistically, and then understand in the journey how we can actually build the experiences that we need, the networks that students require, the connections that they desire to actually take them on that journey of belonging across all of those dimensions. And many of the elements you spoke about, Marianne, I think speak to that for me. But for me, having that belonging kind of framework is a kind of a nice way to try and capture it.
Thanks very much, Sherman. Navneet, did you want to add anything to that question?
Just really quickly, I mean, of course, Marianne and Sherman are great here to talk about the how-to here coming from higher ed, but, we're living in this experiences economy. It's the only thing that I would add. And so that loyalty element, that then students get from a great student experience then pays off later in terms of that alumni engagement and mentoring and really giving back to the institution. So I think just thinking about this experiences economy that we're really living in, maybe even looking to how other industries are doing things in that area as well, could be helpful there. So just that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Navneet. All right, well done. Next question. More looking at the sector in Australia and New Zealand. Sherman, what are you seeing institutions doing to innovate to support student employability and lifelong learning? What are some of the innovations you're watching?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and pertinent question, Martin. I was keynoting the ASEN conference yesterday, which is the Australian Collaborative Education Network, and that's a community of practice, and there were like 300 people in that conference, really thinking about work integrated and industry partnered learning. So we had industry partners, we had practitioners, we had a whole bunch of action around work integrated learning and its associated activities. And certainly the piece of thinking that's come very clearly out of that is that more and more in Australian universities, employability is job one, that old car company phrase, quality is job one. Well, it's employability is job one. And that hasn't, to be fair, always been the case. Universities have not always been embracing of an employability agenda. With all due respect to some of my colleagues, in some fora where you actually try to articulate employability, they see it as someone else's job. So I think, there's been a little bit of a shift in the sector just recently, so that we are taking it seriously. And to that end, there are a number of really interesting innovations that are coming up. Work integrated learning has got a long history, but there are different approaches to work integrated learning which are really starting to evolve. Certainly, there's some exploration of higher apprenticeships happening. There's some really interesting flexibility around work integrated learning, online approaches, group-based project work. Some real deep engagement with industry. I know here at RMIT, we're very keen to ensure that we take what we call an industry partnered learning approach, which embeds work integrated learning scaffolded throughout an undergraduate degree, so that it's not just one work integrated learning experience, but several that a student has, and combining that with what practitioners might call career development learning, to ensure that the learners actually have career planning and career development kind of ability and capability alongside the experience they'll get out of the work integrated learning. The other thing that we can absolutely do is, and many of the learning management platforms at RMIT, we've got a system which has an enduring portfolio for students, so they can capture the outcomes of their learning, and it's now incumbent on us to ensure that they can communicate what they've learned and how applicable that learning is to a future employer, using the portfolio and the tools that they have at their hand. The other thing that we're doing is really building on the flexibility. So working around what the curriculum looks like, making sure there's a flexibility of offering a modularity and a stackability, so that particularly in the postgraduate space, there's a greater opportunity to study those shorter, sharper courses, the more on-demand approaches, the upskilling that people see throughout their lifelong learning. And clearly in conversations I have around the sector, there's a lot of thinking around what that lifelong learning looks like, what those smaller short courses might look like, and how that all fits together to improve the employability. I know I was challenged at another meeting the other day where I think the Australian Industry Group and the Tech Council was saying there's 250,000 jobs in cyber at the moment that are going begging. They're desperate for people. And I challenged those stakeholders, and I said, well, if that's the case, why in the graduate outcomes survey in Australia and New Zealand do we only have 70% employment rates from our graduates in those sectors? If there are really 250,000 jobs available, surely the GOS outcome should be closer to 95, 96% or something. And the clear answer was, you're not teaching them the right things. Yeah. So I think, this is less about innovation in its purest sense, but more about how as a university we need to actually better engage with industry and understand the needs of industry, and actually, whilst respecting the traditions of the academic project and the community of scholars, we can embed that employability outcome and actually provide our learners with what they need for that employment. I might stop there because I could go on forever.
Can I jump in?
As could I, Sherman. Yes, of course, Marianne, dive right in.
That was fantastic, Sherman. And I think just to go to your final point there, I think we absolutely need to get better at bringing industry, employers, and bless them, recent alumni into our classrooms, but also into our program reviews. And if we don't already have them, we really need those industry advisory bodies for those programs or for our colleges or faculties, so that we're in a constant conversation about what's relevant now for industry, so that we can be really letting that inform our thinking. I think as well, it's really incumbent upon us to make sure that our students, when they graduate, have a really good language to talk about, not just the knowledge they acquired in the course of their studies, but the skills that they've developed. And I'd like to see that coming right down to the level of things like the individual assessment task. What skills is this task developing and testing? And on that front, I think we need to do some work with our staff, because I don't think our staff are necessarily at the moment well prepared to have all of those conversations around skills, because we focus so much on the knowledge side of things. I think another thing is we also need to help students leverage their part-time work experience. Often that gets downplayed because those are not necessarily, quality jobs, but there's a lot that students are developing there that will stand them in good stead when they go out, post-graduation to seek employment. So we need to make sure that we're properly leveraging that. And I think as well, we can probably look to some more innovative degree shapes, even at the undergraduate level. We just launched some new degrees here in one of our colleges, which also include a year in industry as an actual part of that degree program. And imagine what it would be like to be graduating, having already spent a year working in the relevant industry. Now, that's taken a lot of planning to bring off, and it won't necessarily be for everyone, but quite magical if we can start to look at that kind of innovation in the shape of our degrees as well.
Some absolutely brilliant concrete examples. Thank you to both of you. And it was interesting, in a report that I worked on last year with Professor Dawkins, we sort of turned it around from work integrated learning to learning integrated work. And it doesn't really matter which way you look at it. The idea of bringing those worlds dynamically together to create more meaningful employment outcomes for our graduates is absolutely priority number one as far as I'm concerned. And it sounds like for you too, Sherman and Marianne, you're on that journey as well. Navneet, what about for you? Anything to add on that one?
No, I think what Marianne and Sherman shared was great. I was, Martin, thinking about what you said at the beginning as I just shared the findings of the report about regardless of what jobs students might want to go into, it's really about thinking about those skills. And as Marianne said, hearing from employers, what are some of those, those desirable skills that most students should have, regardless of then what job they go into later.
And it's also bringing it context, Navneet. So, you could say a 21st century competency is communication, but what's expected from a communication perspective in one profession versus another, albeit the same techniques are used, landing it effectively could be quite different. And I think, Marianne, that's your notion of how can you give that hands-on ability to understand whilst you're going through the degree is very, very powerful. All right, we're going to move to the next question. And Marianne, I'm going to go to you, and you touched on it actually earlier, but what do you think universities can do to be more inclusive and provide greater flexibility for today's diverse learners? I was really intrigued by the answers you gave in the last question about it. We need to be, when we think about onboarding, it isn't one size fits all. We need to think about diversity, but what else in this area of flexibility and including diverse learners?
There's so much in that, Martin, and I might need to sort of pull some of those things apart. I mean, obviously, I think, we need to have a look at orientation, transition, and first year, as I mentioned, and not assuming that everyone is coming to us from the same place. So not assuming, for example, that everyone's arriving with the same educational and cultural capital, I think is quite important, particularly when we talk about wanting to diversify our first year intake. We need to make sure that we not only are successful in recruiting that diverse student body, but that we give them a good experience, because history has shown us that often we're better at getting them in, but we don't understand that their needs may be different. So we're still providing the same education we ever did, regardless of who we now have here. So I think really being, careful to make sure that we acknowledge and use our data to show us, who is actually here at the university with us. I've seen some fantastic examples. They actually came out of the UK, and they were guides for first year students, and they did just a wonderful job of explaining all the new terminology that's actually associated with universities. I mean, if you're first in family, do you know what a tutorial is? Do you know what you're meant to do in a tutorial? These can actually be really quite confronting and potentially, shaming experiences for students if they just don't know what higher education actually entails. So actually acknowledge we may have students who need a bit more, explanation, who need a bit more information, who need to have us articulate our expectations more clearly for them. I think that's going to be really quite important for us to know that that's, a necessary part of bringing students into the organisation. The question about flexibility is a really interesting one, and it's one that, you know, there's few things really that keep me up at night, but this one does, because I think that COVID really sounded the death knell on what used to be quite standard, which was what I would call the appointment model of learning. You know, we say when, we say where, and we expect you to be there. Students experienced, you know, new levels of flexibility during COVID, and they do not want to give those up. And at the heart of that is something that we've never really ever talked about, and we certainly have never privileged, and that is students' own time. We've arranged everything to suit the organisation's understanding of what's important in terms of time. And one of the things that's really becoming clear is that students want us to respect their time in ways that we haven't. So, for example, you know, to give a real life example from conversations with student leaders here, when we look to wind back some of our COVID learning supports, students said to us, but that will make it harder for me to manage my part-time work, and look at the cost of living here in Canberra. So the flexibility that we created because of the pandemic, they're seeing works for them in terms of the complexities of their daily lives. So I think that we are going to have to think about how we deliver forms of flexibility that support students in their lives, but also support them properly in their learning. And how we might design that flexibility, I think, will be different at different universities, different at different levels of study. I think what we might do at undergraduate will be completely different probably from what we might do at postgraduate. But I think that there is a bit of a risk here, and that is that, you know, we may end up with a kind of a two-track learning experience if we're not careful, particularly if we go down the path of, you know, hybrid learning, which, you know, and students will often say to me, I want to be able to choose week on, week off, whether I attend on campus or online, which is probably not something I think that we would find sustainable. But I do worry that there may be students who perhaps don't have the same kinds of, you know, demands for part-time work, who have more opportunities to be fully present on campus and can have one kind of learning experience. And then students who are facing lengthy commutes, have significant part-time work, may opt for an online experience that's just not going to give them the same kind of university experience. And I think as university leaders, that's the last thing that we want to be designing for. We want to design for something that's going to work for our students, that will offer flexibility, but won't bifurcate into that kind of two-track element there. So I think those are some of the things that are concerning me as I'm talking to students about what they are saying they'd like to see, but also trying to, you know, imagine what a really good learning experience is going to be for the diversity of students that we're going to have in coming years.
Oh, look, that's fantastic, Marianne. Thank you. And it strikes me that the learning is really important, but that sense of belonging to the institution too, and community, and designing with purpose for the new world that we're in, but also providing flexibility, but not so much that our students are actually blind to what they're missing out on because we didn't scaffold in the whole university experience. And it's tough, you know, I describe it as omni-channel. I mean, I think it's going to be sadly hybrid and fully on campus. I think there's going to be this plethora of models that our students are going to demand. And eventually we're going to your point, Marianne, need to sort of say, this is what we stand for as an institution. This is our experience. This is what you'll get when you come to us. Sherman, thoughts? Anything extra?
I'm just totally agreeing with that last sentiment of yours, Martin. I think that the danger we have, I think, as institutions, is trying to be a single institution being everything to everybody. I appreciate the need for some flexibility and the understanding of a diversity of students and their various constraints, but you know, there is a certain part of me which thinks, as an institution, you have values and an approach to learning that you should embrace and be proud of. And if, you know, this is going to sound a little bit blunt, but if learners want more flexibility than you're prepared to offer, that's okay, because some other institution might offer that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's entirely possible to to focus on the types of learners that you actually want to ensure that you address. And I know at RMIT we're very keen around an applied learning approach. It's really about experiential learning. It's practical. That's what we've always had a history of, and that's what we want to pursue as our pedagogical approach. And so that immediately constrains how much flexibility we can give, because whilst you can have Labster and science labs on your computer terminals, there is something a little bit different about pouring chemicals into a test tube and seeing them blow up in a fume cabinet, and those opportunities we don't want to lose. And the sort of disciplines that we have and the sort of learning that we encourage, there will have to be, I think, some constraints to the flexibility that we actually allow. And I'm happy to prosecute that argument and be very clear around RMIT and what our ambition is, and we will moderate at the edges as required. But at some point, if a student wants things that we don't offer, that might be okay.
Yeah, thank you, Sherman. Navneet, anything to add to this conversation?
Just thinking about learner agency, I think, it's nothing new, but students are definitely being more vocal and clear about what they want. So I think in this question that you're asking about what more can institutions do to increase that flexibility and to really help diverse learners, I think students are not really shy about, really stating what they want now, I think more than in previous years. I'm just thinking back to my own university experience, where what the university provided seemed like a lot, that that was almost enough. I don't think I was in that group of students that demanded more, but it's a different time that we're in now. So I was just thinking of that learner agency there.
Yeah, different time, different experiences being demanded too. All right, Sherman, I'd like to get to our audience questions in about 3 minutes, but I'm going to throw the last one to you because I think it's important. So Sherman, how do you think technology can enable social connections and enrich learning experiences? How can it not just simply be, doing what we did on campus and sticking it online? What are your thoughts? I know this could be a 3-day workshop, Sherman, but give it your best shot.
This is a 30,000 word treatise, I think, Martin. Look, I think for me, you just have to simply reflect on what happens in the broader social environment. And technology has enabled a way of connections that, quite frankly, here's the living example, we connect through technology. It's how we do it for a large part. And the parallels with the learning environment are pretty obvious. We have the platforms and tools which enable us to do different things with our technologies. The affordances of the digital connections are different. We can do one-to-many far more easily. We can do many-to-one far more easily. We can do one-to-one in discrete ways very, very easily in ways that the face-to-face do not allow. There's different privacy and channels that we can use. There's avatars, there's identities, there's a whole range of really interesting opportunities that sit within the digital environments that allow us to do that. And I guess the question for institutions is pretty stark. It's like, how much do we want to build and use bespoke to the university? And how much do we simply accept that students will use Insta or TikTok or Snapchat or Facebook or whatever, and let those connections flourish and support them in those natural environments? That's probably enough for now, because otherwise I'll go down rabbit burrows.
Look, you did brilliantly. Please, Marianne.
We've been, we're obviously embarking on quite a significant digital uplift here at the ANU, and we've been doing some fairly extensive discovery work with students in particular before we launch into our design. But one of the things that was really interesting, there's lots of things we could do better, in our university, in any university. But what the discovery work was really fantastic for highlighting for us was, of all the things we might do, which ones would actually matter to students? And I think that honing in on the things that matter and working on those is going to be critically important, because, you can create laundry lists of things we could do better, but none of us have, endless time and endless buckets of money. So really being able to find out from students, what are the half dozen things that really would make a difference, but that really would matter, I think is going to be very important for us. And also finding ways to ensure that we have a kind of continuous capacity to tap that student voice. That's one of the things we're working on at the moment, so that at any moment we can be testing, how are we going on this front? How are we going on that front? Getting back a little bit, I guess, to things that people in other industries, in other consumer industries do to find out, are people happy with the experience that we're delivering? We need to get better at doing that as well, I think.
Lovely, thank you. All right, well, we're going to dive into some of our audience questions now, and then I won't get to them all. We've got a fantastic body of questions here that I'm sure the THE team and Salesforce will do their best to get you answers to. But Navneet, there's a number of questions coming in around personalization. I'll actually grab Selma's as a proxy, but there's about 5 of them. Great presentation. Well done, Navneet. What did the students mean by personalized experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I saw those coming in, Martin. And, one of the things that you'll see in the report, and I'm going to quote something here from Brendan Hughes, who's the Director of Student Engagement at the University of South Australia, who was really focused on that need for personalization, specifically in marketing and communications. So when we've asked about personalization in this study, we're really referring to how personalized is that outreach to students or even those that express an interest in the campus, and then those ongoing communications as the student is there. And so what Brendan said or advocates for is really this drip feed approach, as he said, in which students receive this just-in-time communications depending on their personal needs, rather than overwhelming students with lots of information or orientation, and then throughout their time at the university, really just sending students messages with content that's really tailored to their academic interests or even their schedule and extracurricular activities. And also listening to students about, what channel do they want that communication and information to come in on? Is it text message? Is it Twitter? Is it email? And so really engaging in that active listening there. So when we're talking about personalization, we're really talking about, that initial marketing and tailoring that, and then also the ongoing communications to make sure it's not just anything and everything that's sent out to students.
It's probably
Brilliant.
not going to be.
Sorry, Marianne, I spoke over you. Can you repeat that?
It's probably not going to be Twitter that they want to communicate.
No.
Agreed.
Twitter's for old people.
Hey, Sherman, I'll let you lead out on this one. It's a question from Kate. Much of the presentation's been about how the university provides the student experience. What can be done by a single academic to contribute to these student needs, Sherman?
Look, I think we all know that the best student experiences are those where there's a single academic that they have an incredible learning relationship with. We've all been inspired by great teaching, and those individual experiences, I think, are really, really important. So I think an individual academic has an amazing opportunity to be, a mentor, an inspirer, someone to really exemplify the discipline, the profession, the learning that they wish to espouse, and that can be done by simply being the best person that you are at the time in the classroom and around it.
Brilliant, thank you. Marianne, I'm sure you might have a couple of thoughts on that one.
Look, absolutely. And some of the things that we developed up during COVID, they weren't new, but things like, welcome messages that students can view in the weeks preceding class that don't just tell them, what's going to be happening in that particular class, but actually tell them a little bit about who's going to be teaching it, what makes you tick, why are you excited and passionate about this particular subject matter, what do you do when you're also doing your research, what's your research about, but also how does this particular class connect to other classes that students have done previously or are going to be doing. So those sorts of things that actually just set up, you know, an actual person, you know, there that students can start to identify with and engage with. But I think the other is also using things like the kind of analytics you can get out of your, you know, course sites to make sure that you're tracking, you know, how the students are progressing, dropping in with messages to those students who might be lagging behind a little bit, you know, just all those things that show that you're engaged. And I think one of the things I really like about really well-designed online course sites is that they give us a kind of expanded learning envelope, you know, so that you can be popping in at different points in the week with just some particular messages, following up on things that may have been mentioned in class, dropping in pieces of information, new, you know, things that you might have found in the media that were relevant for the course, just basically showing that you're enthusiastic and interested and engaged. I think really just makes the difference. And so many of our academics are exactly that. And that's what stands out.
And that's what we see show up in the student data as well. No, I couldn't agree more, Marianne. Navneet, did you have anything to add on that one before I go to our last question?
No, Martin, let's go to the last question.
All right. Firstly, thank you to all the panelists today. According to Louise Knowles, I couldn't agree more, Louise. Thank you to our three wonderful panelists. And Louise's question, do you think there's a trade-off between offering flexibility, i.e. online and hybrid formats of learning, and students feeling like they totally belong? I think it's such a great question to focus on. So is there a trade-off between flexibility and hybrid versus totally belonging? Sherman.
I think there is. We touched on this a little bit previously when we were talking about the constraints of flexibility, but I think, and apologies, someone just started the whippersnipper outside the window, so hopefully that's not impinging. I think my answer is really more about how the institution then has to focus its energies across different areas and doesn't then have the capability or capacity to perhaps build their belonging in a focused way. So I think that's a constraint that's a real one. You know, as Marianne suggested in another area, you know, we do have limited resources and it's probably impossible to be everything to everybody. And so whilst it's entirely possible to build, I think, a terrific sense of belonging if you're fully online, you can devote the energy, you can do the learning design, you can build some amazing online experiences. If you're focusing on that, as well as trying to build an amazing on-campus experience, I just don't think it's sustainable. So I think that's where the danger lies.
Thank you, Sherman. Marianne?
I think as we've highlighted across a number of our responses, we're entering into a moment where I think each of us in our different institutions is intentionally designing what learning is going to look like, what we're going to offer, or indeed what we're going to be able to offer, because I don't think we can all offer everything. So that articulation of what's the experience here going to be like is going to be really important for students choosing that experience. And I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't find in coming years that we are seeing students starting one place and moving somewhere else as they begin to understand what it is they're looking for in a learning experience and what it is we might be offering. So I do think being able to sort of talk about what's going to be the model of learning, the sort of student experience that we're offering here is going to become something that's going to be much more upfront, and students are really going to want to know what that is. So to make sure that their learning and their life fit together in the ways in which they anticipate them working well for them.
And I think we need to then celebrate Australian universities being different, Marianne, being really upfront and honest about what they stand for their university experience and being proud of that and not trying to homogenize the sector, but really allowing people to create that rich tapestry. Navneet, anything from you on that question before I go into wrap-up mode?
No, I was just going to say that I think back to the question you asked Sherman about, you know, the role of technology in this as well. I think, you know, there's a huge opportunity to eliminate some of the silos that currently exist that don't allow for that opportunity to really connect with students, regardless of whether they're learning at home or on campus. So I think, you know, there's just some more, I think lots more that can be sort of done there as well. But I think I could talk about it from a Salesforce perspective for about an hour. So Martin, I'm going to let you wrap up.
Next time. Can you,
yes.
Navneet, can you bring up that final resources slide for me?
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to thank you for your participation today. I'm sorry we weren't able to get through all the wonderful questions in the chat. We'll get back to some of you with answers to those, particularly the technical ones around the data. To Sherman, Marianne, and Navneet, thank you so very, very much for your wonderful conversation today. And what you'll see on the screen now are just 3 resources for higher education. And the one you definitely want to grab is the report. There was a question about how to get access to that. So here it is. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your day and thank you for being with us. Bye now.